This is the Archivist. Tonight we step through the marble columns of a forgotten temple where the morning mist still carries the scent of frankincense and the whispered prayers of those who served the gods in ways we have nearly forgotten. We walk softly into a world where the sacred and the everyday intertwined like threads in a tapestry, where priestesses moved through their days not as distant figures of mystery, but as women who found the divine in the simple act of lighting a lamp at dawn, of grinding herbs in the afternoon sun, of keeping vigil through the gentle hours of night. The scroll unfolds now, and the ancient stones remember what it truly meant to live between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. In the hour before dawn, when the world held its breath between night and day, I found myself standing in the courtyard of a temple dedicated to Athena, somewhere in the hills above what would one day be called Athens. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of olive trees and the lingering traces of incense from the evening's final prayers. The marble columns, pale as moonlight, seemed to glow with their own inner radiance in the pre-dawn darkness. This was the hour that belonged to Melania, a priestess whose name meant Dark One, but whose presence seemed to bring light to every corner of the sacred space. She moved through the temple with the quiet confidence of someone who had performed these same rituals for more years than she could count, her bare feet making no sound on the smooth stone floors that had been worn to silk by generations of worshippers. The temple was not the grand structure of marble and gold that we might imagine from stories and paintings. It was smaller, more intimate, built into the hillside so that it seemed to grow from the earth itself. The walls were of local stone fitted together with such precision that no mortar was needed, and the roof was supported by columns that had been carved from single blocks of marble, their surfaces polished until they reflected the flickering light of the oil lamps like still water. Melania's first task, performed in the darkness before even the earliest birds began to sing, was the lighting of the sacred flame. This was not simply a matter of striking flint to tinder, but a ritual that connected her to the goddess she served and to all the priestesses who had performed this same act before her. The flame had been burning continuously for more than a century, tended day and night by women who understood that to let it die would be to break the connection between the mortal world and the divine. The oil that fed the flame was not ordinary olive oil, but oil that had been blessed and purified through a process that took many days. The olives were harvested only at the full moon, pressed by women who had fasted and purified themselves, and the resulting oil was stored in vessels that had been consecrated to the goddess. Each drop was precious, not just for its material value, but for the spiritual significance it carried. I watched as Melania approached the altar where the sacred flame burned, her movements slow and deliberate. She carried with her a small clay lamp, its wick freshly trimmed, and as she lit it from the eternal flame, she whispered a prayer so softly that I could barely hear the words. But the prayer was not just words, it was a conversation, a greeting to the goddess who was believed to be present in the flame, an acknowledgement of the sacred trust that had been placed in her hands. The lighting of the lamp was followed by the lighting of others throughout the temple. Each lamp had its place and its purpose, and Melania moved from one to another with the practiced efficiency of someone who could perform these tasks in complete darkness. Some lamps illuminated the statue of the goddess, casting dancing shadows that seemed to bring the carved marble to life. Others were placed at the entrances to the temple, welcoming any who might come to worship in the early hours of the day. But it was not just the lighting of lamps that marked the beginning of the temple day. As the first pale light began to appear in the eastern sky, Melania began the process of preparing the temple for the day's activities. This involved not just the physical cleaning and arranging that any building required, but the spiritual preparation that would make the space ready to receive both gods and mortals. The floors were swept not just to remove dust and debris, but as an act of purification, each stroke of the broom accompanied by silent prayers. The altar was cleaned and arranged, with fresh flowers placed before the statue of the goddess, and the sacred vessels polished until they gleamed in the lamplight. Water was drawn from the sacred spring that bubbled up from the rocks beneath the temple, water that was believed to carry the blessing of the goddess herself. As she worked, Melania was joined by other priestesses, women of various ages, who had dedicated their lives to the service of Athena. There was Thalia, an older woman whose grey hair was always perfectly arranged, and whose knowledge of the ancient rituals was encyclopedic. There was young Ione, barely past her 20th year, who had come to the temple as a child and had grown up within its walls. And there was Demetria, a woman of middle years who had once been married but had chosen to leave her former life behind to serve the goddess. Each woman had her own tasks, her own responsibilities, but they worked together with the harmony of those who had learned to move as one body in service of something greater than themselves. There was no hurry in their movements, no sense of urgency or stress. They understood that the gods existed outside of mortal time, and that the rituals they performed were not bound by the same constraints that governed ordinary life. As the sky began to lighten and the first birds began to sing, the temple took on a different quality. The shadows that had seemed so deep and mysterious in the darkness began to soften and retreat, revealing details that had been hidden in the night. The carved decorations on the columns became visible, intricate patterns of leaves and flowers that seemed to dance in the growing light. The painted walls, their colors muted by age but still beautiful, began to glow with warm hues of red and gold and blue. The statue of Athena herself, which had seemed almost alive in the flickering lamplight, now revealed itself in all its carved perfection. The goddess stood tall and serene, her owl perched on her shoulder, her spear held loosely in one hand, while the other was raised in a gesture of blessing. Her eyes, inlaid with precious stones, seemed to follow the movements of the priestesses as they went about their work. And more than once I saw one of the women pause in her tasks to meet that marble gaze with a look of devotion and love. But perhaps most remarkable of all was the way the temple seemed to come alive as the dawn progressed. What had been a place of quiet solitude in the darkness became a space filled with gentle activity and purpose. The priestesses moved through their tasks with increasing energy as the light grew stronger, their voices beginning to blend in the soft chanting that would continue throughout the day. The chanting was not the formal, structured singing that we might expect from religious services, but something more organic and natural. It rose and fell like breathing, sometimes swelling to fill the entire temple with sound, sometimes dropping to barely audible whispers. The words were ancient, passed down through generations of priestesses, and they spoke of the goddess's wisdom, her protection, her eternal presence in the lives of those who served her. As the sun finally appeared above the horizon, sending its first rays through the eastern windows of the temple, Melania performed the final ritual of the dawn preparation. She took a handful of frankincense from a small silver box and placed it on the glowing coals of a bronze brazier. The incense caught fire immediately, sending up a column of fragrant smoke that rose toward the painted ceiling and seemed to carry with it all the prayers and hopes of the morning. the scent of the frankincense mixed with the other odors of the temple, the olive oil of the lamps, the fresh flowers on the altar, the clean smell of the swept stone floors, to create an atmosphere that was both earthly and divine. It was a smell that spoke of centuries of worship, of countless prayers offered and received, of the eternal conversation between mortals and gods that was the heart of all religious practice. And as the temple filled with the golden light of the rising sun, I understood that what I was witnessing was not just the beginning of another day, but the continuation of a tradition that stretched back through time like an unbroken chain. Each morning brought the same rituals, the same careful preparation, the same dedication to maintaining the connection between the human and divine worlds. It was work that required not just physical effort, but spiritual discipline, emotional commitment, and a deep understanding of the mysteries that lay at the heart of existence. The dawn was complete, and the temple was ready. The sacred flame burned bright and steady. The lamps cast their warm light on polished marble and painted walls, and the priestesses stood ready to welcome whatever the day might bring. They had performed their first and most important duty. They had ensured that the goddess would be properly honored and that the temple would be a fitting place for mortals to encounter the divine. As the morning light strengthened and the temple settled into the rhythm of the day, I discovered that even the most mundane activities took on a sacred quality within these marble walls. The preparation and sharing of the morning meal was not simply a matter of satisfying hunger, but a ritual that connected the priestesses to the goddess they served and to the natural world that provided their sustenance. The kitchen of the temple was a marvel of simple efficiency, built into the hillside behind the main sanctuary, where the smoke from the cooking fires would not interfere with the sacred flames. The walls were lined with shelves that held clay vessels of various sizes, each one carefully labeled with symbols that indicated its contents. There were jars of olive oil, containers of honey, baskets of dried herbs, and amphorae filled with wine that had been blessed for ceremonial use. Thalia, the eldest of the priestesses, oversaw the preparation of the morning meal with the same careful attention that she brought to the most solemn religious ceremonies. Her hands, weathered by years of service but still steady and sure, moved among the ingredients with the confidence of someone who understood not just how to prepare food, but how to transform simple ingredients into something that would nourish both body and spirit. The bread that formed the foundation of the meal had been baked the evening before, using grain that had been grown in the temple's own fields and ground by the priestesses themselves. The wheat had been harvested with prayers of thanksgiving, threshed with songs of praise, and ground in a mill that was blessed each time it was used. The resulting flour was not just food, but a gift from the goddess, a tangible reminder of her provision and care. I watched as Thalia broke the bread into portions, her movements deliberate and reverent. Each piece was examined carefully, and any that were not perfect were set aside to be used for other purposes. The bread that would be shared at the morning meal had to be without flaw, a reflection of the perfection that the priestesses sought to achieve in all their service to the goddess. The honey that would sweeten the bread came from hives that were kept in the temple's garden, tended by Ione with the same devotion that she brought to all her duties. The bees were considered sacred to Athena, symbols of the industrious wisdom that the goddess embodied, and their honey was believed to carry special properties that could enhance both physical health and spiritual insight. As Ione drizzled the golden honey over the bread, she whispered a prayer of gratitude to the bees and to the goddess who had provided this sweetness. The honey caught the morning light as it flowed, creating patterns that seemed almost like writing, as if the goddess herself were inscribing blessings on the simple meal. The olive oil that accompanied the bread was equally sacred, pressed from olives that grew in the grove that surrounded the temple. These trees were ancient, some of them planted by the first priestesses who had served at this site, and they were tended with the reverence due to living monuments to the goddess's enduring presence. The oil they produced was rich and golden, with a flavor that spoke of sunshine and earth and the patient work of generations. But it was not just the ingredients that made the meal sacred, it was the way it was prepared and shared. The priestesses gathered around a simple wooden table, their movements unhurried and graceful. There was no conversation during the meal, but the silence was not empty or uncomfortable. It was filled with a sense of communion, not just with each other, but with the goddess who was believed to be present at every meal shared in her honor. Before eating, each priestess took a small portion of her bread and placed it on a special plate that sat in the center of the table. This was the goddess's portion, an acknowledgement that all food was ultimately a gift from the divine, and that the first and best should always be offered in gratitude. The plate would later be taken to the altar, where the food would be burned as an offering, the smoke carrying the priestess's thanksgiving up to the realm of the gods. The act of eating itself was performed with the same mindfulness that characterized all the temple activities. Each bite was taken slowly, savored not just for its flavor, but for the nourishment it provided and the connection it represented to the natural world. The bread was chewed thoroughly, the honey allowed to dissolve slowly on the tongue, the olive oil appreciated for its richness and complexity. As they ate, the priestesses' faces reflected a deep contentment that went beyond simple satisfaction with food. They understood that they were participating in one of the most fundamental acts of human existence, the transformation of the gifts of the earth into the energy needed to serve the divine. Every meal was a reminder of their dependence on forces greater than themselves, and of their responsibility to use the strength they gained in service to the goddess. The water that accompanied the meal came from the sacred spring that bubbled up from the rocks beneath the temple. This water was believed to have special properties, blessed by the goddess herself and capable of purifying both body and spirit. It was served in simple clay cups that had been made by the priestesses themselves, their surfaces smooth and unadorned, but perfect in their simplicity. Demetria, who had once been known for her skill as a potter before dedicating her life to the temple, had made most of these cups during her early years of service. Each one was slightly different, shaped by her hands and fired in the temple's own kiln, but all shared a quality of quiet beauty that reflected the spiritual discipline of their maker. To drink from these cups was to participate in a tradition that connected the present moment to all the meals that had been shared in this place before. As the meal drew to a close, the priestesses performed a final ritual of gratitude. They stood together around the table, their hands joined in a circle, and spoke in unison a prayer of thanksgiving that had been passed down through generations of temple servants. The words were simple but profound, acknowledging the goddess's provision, asking for strength to serve faithfully through the day ahead, and expressing gratitude for the community of women who shared this sacred work. The cleanup that followed the meal was performed with the same care and attention that had characterized its preparation. The dishes were washed in water that had been blessed, dried with cloths that had been woven by the priestesses themselves, and put away in their proper places with the reverence due to sacred objects. Even the crumbs from the table were carefully gathered and taken outside to be scattered for the birds, ensuring that nothing was wasted. and that the goddess's gifts were shared with all her creatures. But perhaps most remarkable of all was the way this simple meal had served to strengthen the bonds between the priestesses and to prepare them for the day's work ahead. They had shared not just food, but a moment of communion that reminded them of their common purpose and their mutual dependence. They had acknowledged their gratitude to the goddess and their commitment to serving her faithfully, and they had nourished their bodies in a way that would give them the energy needed to perform their duties with grace and dedication. As the morning meal concluded and the priestesses began to disperse to their various tasks, I could see in their faces a quiet satisfaction that went beyond simple physical nourishment. They had begun their day not just by filling their stomachs, but by feeding their souls, by participating in a ritual that connected them to the divine source of all sustenance and to the community of women who shared their sacred calling. The kitchen was left spotless, ready for the preparation of the next meal, and the priestesses moved on to their other duties with the calm energy that came from having properly honored both their physical needs and their spiritual obligations. They understood that there was no separation between the sacred and the mundane, that every act performed in service to the goddess was equally holy, whether it was the lighting of the sacred flame or the simple sharing of bread and honey in the morning light. As the morning progressed and the temple filled with the warm golden light of the climbing sun, I found myself drawn to observe the intricate preparations that would transform the sacred space for the day's ceremonies. This was not the hurried setup of a modern event, but a slow, meditative process that was itself a form of worship, each action performed with the reverence due to something that would soon be touched by the divine. In a small chamber adjacent to the main sanctuary, Ione worked with materials that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Before her, on a low marble table, were arranged the ingredients for the day's incense: frankincense tears that looked like drops of golden amber, myrrh resin dark as dried blood, and aromatic herbs that had been gathered at specific times of the lunar cycle and dried in the temple's own herb garden. Each substance had been chosen not just for its fragrance, but for its spiritual properties and its ability to carry prayers upward to the realm of the gods. The grinding of the incense was performed with a mortar and pestle made of black marble, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of use. Ione's movements were rhythmic and meditative, the pestle turning in slow circles as she reduced the resins and herbs to a fine powder. The sound was hypnotic, a soft grinding that seemed to match the rhythm of breathing, of heartbeat, of the eternal cycles that governed both mortal and divine existence. As she worked, Ione whispered prayers over the ingredients, her voice so soft that the words seemed to merge with the sound of the grinding. She was not simply preparing incense, but creating a medium through which the prayers of the faithful could ascend to the goddess. Each grain of powder was blessed, each fragment of resin consecrated, until the entire mixture became something more than the sum of its parts, a sacred substance capable of bridging the gap between earth and heaven. The frankincense, she explained to me in whispers, came from trees that grew in the distant lands beyond the great sea, trees that were said to weep tears of gold when the wind sang through their branches. The myrrh was equally precious, harvested from thorny shrubs that grew in the desert places where the earth met the sky. These substances had traveled great distances to reach this temple, carried by merchants who understood that they were transporting not just trade goods, but materials essential to the worship of the gods. But it was not just the exotic ingredients that made the incense sacred. Mixed with the frankincense and myrrh were herbs that had been grown in the temple's own garden, tended by the priestesses with the same care they gave to their prayers. There was lavender, whose purple flowers had been picked at dawn when the dew still clung to their petals. There was rosemary, whose needle-like leaves held the memory of sunshine and rain. There was sage, whose silver-green foliage was believed to carry the wisdom of the goddess herself. Each herb had been harvested at the proper time, according to knowledge that had been passed down through generations of temple servants. The lavender was picked when the moon was full, the rosemary when the sun was at its highest point in the sky, the sage during the quiet hours just before dawn. This timing was not mere superstition, but an understanding of the subtle rhythms that governed the natural world and the way those rhythms could be harnessed in service to the divine. As Ione continued her work, I became aware of other preparations taking place throughout the temple. In the main sanctuary, Melania was arranging the altar with the precision of someone who understood that every detail mattered. The statue of Athena was cleaned with soft cloths that had been blessed in the sacred spring, her marble surface polished until it seemed to glow with inner light. The owl perched on her shoulder was given special attention, its carved feathers dusted with a brush made from the finest horsehair. The offerings that would be presented during the day's ceremonies were arranged with equal care. There were fruits from the temple's orchard, apples whose red skin caught the light like jewels, pears whose golden flesh promised sweetness, grapes that hung in perfect clusters from vines that had been blessed by the goddess herself. There were flowers from the garden, their colors chosen to harmonize with the painted decorations on the temple walls, and there were vessels of oil and wine, their contents blessed and purified according to ancient rituals. But perhaps most important of all were the sacred vessels that would be used in the ceremonies. These were not ordinary pottery, but works of art that had been created specifically for temple use. Some were made of silver that had been mined from the sacred mountains and worked by craftsmen who had dedicated their skills to the service of the gods. Others were carved from marble that had been quarried from the same hills where the temple stood, their surfaces decorated with images of owls and olive branches and other symbols sacred to Athena. Each vessel had its own purpose and its own place in the ritual. There were libation bowls for pouring offerings of wine and oil, their wide mouths designed to allow the liquid to flow in graceful streams. There were incense burners with perforated lids that would allow the sacred smoke to escape in patterns that seemed to dance in the air. There were water basins for purification, their surfaces polished to mirror-like perfection, so that those who looked into them might see not just their own reflection, but a glimpse of the divine. The preparation of these vessels was itself a ritual. Each one was washed in water from the sacred spring, dried with cloths that had been woven by the priestesses, and polished with oils that had been blessed for this purpose. As they worked, the priestesses whispered prayers over each vessel, asking the goddess to bless their use and to make them worthy instruments of worship. In another part of the temple, Thalia was preparing the sacred texts that would be read during the day's ceremonies. These were not books as we might know them, but scrolls of papyrus and parchment, their surfaces covered with writing that seemed to glow in the lamplight. The texts contained hymns of praise to the goddess, stories of her deeds and her wisdom, and prayers that had been composed by generations of priestesses who had served in this place. The preparation of the texts was as careful as any other aspect of the temple service. Each scroll was unrolled slowly and examined for any signs of damage or wear. The writing was checked to ensure that it remained clear and legible, and any sections that had begun to fade were carefully retouched with ink that had been blessed for this purpose. The scrolls were then rolled again and placed in special containers that would protect them from dust and moisture. But it was not just the physical preparation of the texts that mattered. It was the spiritual preparation of those who would read them. Thalia spent time in meditation before each ceremony, not just memorizing the words she would speak, but opening her heart and mind to receive the inspiration of the goddess. She understood that she was not simply reciting ancient words, but serving as a conduit through which the divine could speak to the faithful. As the morning progressed, I began to see how all these separate preparations were part of a larger whole, a complex symphony of activity that would culminate in the day's ceremonies. Each priestess had her role to play, her specific responsibilities, but all worked together toward the common goal of creating a space and a time where mortals could encounter the divine. The incense that Ione prepared would carry prayers upward to the goddess. The altar that Melania arranged would provide a focal point for worship and devotion. The vessels that were cleaned and blessed would serve as instruments through which offerings could be made. The texts that Thalia prepared would give voice to the praise and gratitude of the faithful. And all of these elements would come together in ceremonies that were both ancient and eternally new, connecting the present moment to all the worship that had taken place in this sacred space before. But perhaps most remarkable of all was the way this preparation served to transform not just the physical space of the temple, but the spiritual state of the priestesses themselves. As they worked, they moved deeper into a state of reverence and devotion, their ordinary consciousness gradually giving way to an awareness of the sacred that permeated every aspect of their being. They were not just preparing for worship, they were already worshipping, finding the divine in the simple acts of grinding incense, polishing marble, and arranging flowers. By the time the preparations were complete, the temple had been transformed from a beautiful building into something more, a sacred space where the boundary between earth and heaven became thin, where mortals could approach the divine with confidence that their prayers would be heard and their offerings accepted. The priestesses had done more than simply get ready for the day's ceremonies. They had created the conditions under which miracles could occur, where the ordinary could become extraordinary, where the human heart could touch the infinite. As the sun reached its zenith and the temple filled with the brilliant light of noon, I witnessed something that went beyond the ordinary rituals of worship. A ceremony that seemed to open a doorway between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. This was the hour when Athena was believed to be most present, when her wisdom flowed most freely into the world, and when those who served her could glimpse, however briefly, the mysteries that lay at the heart of existence. The ceremony began with the lighting of the great brazier that stood in the center of the sanctuary. This was not the simple lighting of incense that had marked the morning preparations, but something far more elaborate and significant. The brazier itself was a work of art, cast in bronze and decorated with images of owls in flight, their wings spread wide as if they were carrying messages between earth and sky. Melania approached the brazier with the reverence due to the most sacred of objects. In her hands, she carried a torch that had been lit from the eternal flame, its fire dancing in the still air of the temple. But before she could light the brazier, she had to perform a series of purifications that would make her worthy to handle such sacred fire. First, she washed her hands in water from the sacred spring, the liquid flowing over her fingers like liquid silver in the bright sunlight. Then she anointed her forehead with oil that had been blessed by the goddess. the fragrant liquid leaving a glistening mark that caught the light. Finally, she spoke a prayer of preparation, her voice rising and falling in the ancient cadences that had been used in this place for centuries. Only then did she touch the torch to the prepared fuel in the brazier. The fire caught immediately, sending up a column of flame that seemed to reach toward the painted ceiling of the temple. But this was not ordinary fire. It was flame that had been fed with woods and resins chosen for their sacred properties, materials that would burn with colors and fragrances that spoke of the divine presence. The wood that fed the fire came from trees that were sacred to Athena, olive wood from the grove that surrounded the temple, oak from the forests where the goddess was said to walk, cedar from the mountains where she had her dwelling place. Each piece had been cut with prayers and prepared with rituals that transformed it from simple fuel into something capable of carrying mortal offerings up to the realm of the gods. As the fire burned, Ione began to add the incense she had prepared earlier, sprinkling the fragrant powder onto the flames with movements that were both precise and graceful. Each addition sent up clouds of aromatic smoke that filled the temple with scents that seemed to transport the mind to other realms. The frankincense created clouds of golden smoke that caught the sunlight and seemed to glow with their own inner radiance. The myrrh produced darker, more mysterious vapors that spoke of ancient wisdom and hidden knowledge. But it was not just the visual spectacle that made this ceremony so powerful. It was the way it seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the temple. As the smoke rose and spread, the air itself seemed to become thicker, more substantial, as if it were being charged with some invisible energy. The light that streamed through the windows took on a different quality, becoming softer and more diffuse, creating an atmosphere that was both dreamlike and intensely real. The priestesses arranged themselves around the brazier in a pattern that had been established by generations of tradition. Thalia stood to the east, representing the dawn and the beginning of wisdom. Demetria took her place to the south, symbolizing the fullness of knowledge and understanding. Ione positioned herself to the west, embodying the mysteries that came with the setting sun, and Melania stood to the north, representing the eternal and unchanging nature of divine truth. As they took their positions, the priestesses began to chant in voices that seemed to blend into a single, harmonious sound. The words they sang were ancient, passed down through generations of temple servants, and they spoke of the goddess's wisdom, her protection, and her eternal presence in the world. But the chanting was more than just the recitation of sacred texts. It was a form of prayer that engaged not just the mind, but the entire being of those who participated. The rhythm of the chanting seemed to match the flickering of the flames, the rising of the smoke, the very heartbeat of the temple itself. As the voices rose and fell, I could feel something shifting in the atmosphere, as if the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was becoming thinner, more permeable. The statue of Athena, which had seemed beautiful but static in the morning light, now appeared to be almost alive, her marble eyes seeming to follow the movements of the priestesses with benevolent attention. But perhaps most remarkable of all was the way the ceremony seemed to affect the priestesses themselves. As they chanted and moved around the brazier, their faces took on an expression of deep peace and joy that spoke of communion with something far greater than themselves. They were no longer simply women performing a ritual, but conduits through which the divine could manifest in the world. The climax of the ceremony came when Thalia stepped forward and began to speak in a voice that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her ordinary consciousness. Her words were not the prepared texts that she had studied in the morning, but something that seemed to flow through her from a source of wisdom that transcended human understanding. She spoke of the goddess's love for humanity, of the guidance that was always available to those who sought it with sincere hearts, of the mysteries that could be glimpsed by those who dedicated their lives to sacred service. As she spoke, the other priestesses continued their chanting, their voices creating a background of sound that seemed to support and amplify her words. The smoke from the brazier swirled around them all, creating patterns that seemed almost like writing, as if the goddess herself were inscribing messages in the air for those who had eyes to see. The ceremony reached its conclusion as the sun began its descent from the zenith, the brilliant light of noon giving way to the softer radiance of afternoon. The chanting gradually faded to silence. The flames in the brazier settled to a steady glow, and the smoke thinned and dispersed. But the sense of sacred presence that had filled the temple during the ceremony did not disappear. It seemed to settle into the very stones of the building, becoming part of the accumulated holiness that made this place a dwelling for the divine. As the priestesses stepped back from the brazier and began to disperse to their afternoon duties, I could see in their faces the lingering effects of what they had experienced. They moved with a grace and serenity that spoke of having touched something eternal, of having participated in a mystery that connected them not just to their goddess, but to the fundamental forces that governed the universe. The midday ceremony was over, but its effects would continue to resonate throughout the rest of the day. The temple had been charged with sacred energy, the priestesses had been renewed in their dedication, and the connection between earth and heaven had been strengthened. It was a reminder that the divine was not distant and unreachable, but present and accessible to those who approached with reverence and sincere hearts. And as the afternoon light began to slant through the windows of the temple, casting new patterns of shadow and illumination on the marble floors, I understood that what I had witnessed was not just a religious ceremony, but a glimpse into the very heart of what it meant to live a life dedicated to the sacred. The priestesses had shown me that the divine could be found not just in grand gestures and dramatic revelations, but in the patient, faithful performance of daily rituals that opened the heart to wonder and the mind to wisdom. As the intense energy of the midday ceremony settled into the stones and columns of the temple, the afternoon brought with it a different quality of sacred time, quieter, more reflective, filled with the kind of gentle activities that allowed the soul to digest the spiritual nourishment it had received and to prepare for the deeper mysteries that would come with evening. I found Demetria in the temple's garden, a space that was as carefully tended as the sanctuary itself, but with a different kind of beauty. Here, the marble and bronze of the interior gave way to the living artistry of plants and flowers, all chosen for their sacred significance and their ability to create an atmosphere of peace and contemplation. The garden was enclosed by low walls of the same stone as the temple, creating an intimate space that felt both protected and open to the sky. The olive trees that dominated the garden were ancient, their gnarled trunks and silver-green leaves speaking of centuries of growth and endurance. These trees were sacred to Athena, symbols of the peace and prosperity that the goddess brought to those who honored her. Their branches provided shade for the other plants in the garden and created patterns of light and shadow that shifted throughout the day like a slow, natural dance. Beneath the olive trees grew herbs that were used both in the temple ceremonies and in the healing work that was part of the priestesses' service to the community. There was lavender, its purple spikes releasing their fragrance at the slightest touch. There was rosemary, its needle-like leaves holding the warmth of the sun even in the shade. there was sage, whose silver foliage seemed to glow with its own inner light. But it was not just the practical herbs that grew in this sacred space. There were flowers chosen purely for their beauty and their symbolic meaning, white roses that represented purity and devotion, red poppies that spoke of the mysteries of life and death, blue irises that were said to carry messages between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. Each plant had been placed with careful consideration of its needs and its relationship to the others, creating a living tapestry that was both beautiful and meaningful. Demetria moved among the plants with the same reverence she brought to her temple duties, but here her movements were even more gentle, more attuned to the subtle rhythms of growth and season that governed the living world. In her hands she carried a small clay watering vessel, its surface worn smooth by years of use, and as she moved from plant to plant, she whispered soft words of encouragement and blessing. The watering itself was performed with the same mindfulness that characterized all the temple activities. Each plant received exactly the amount of water it needed, no more and no less, and the water was poured slowly and carefully to avoid disturbing the delicate root systems. But more than that, each plant was observed closely, its leaves examined for signs of health or distress, its growth monitored with the attention of someone who understood that these living things were partners in the sacred work of the temple. As she worked, Demetria explained to me in soft whispers the deeper significance of the garden. This was not simply a place where useful plants were grown, but a living symbol of the goddess's creative power, a demonstration of the way divine wisdom could manifest in the natural world. Each plant was a teacher, offering lessons about patience, about the proper timing of growth and rest, about the way beauty and utility could be combined in perfect harmony. The roses, she told me, bloomed in cycles that mirrored the phases of the moon, their opening and closing a reminder of the eternal rhythms that governed all life. The lavender released its fragrance most strongly when the sun was at its highest point, teaching the lesson that true beauty often required the heat of testing to be fully revealed. The sage grew slowly but steadily, its leaves becoming more potent with age, a living example of the way wisdom accumulated over time. But the garden was more than just a collection of individual plants. It was an ecosystem, a community of living things that supported and nourished each other in ways that reflected the ideal relationships between all beings. The olive trees provided shade for the more delicate herbs, while the herbs helped to keep the soil around the trees healthy and fertile. The flowers attracted bees and butterflies, which pollinated the plants and added their own beauty to the garden's symphony of life. As the afternoon progressed, other priestesses joined Demetria in the garden, each bringing her own tasks and her own understanding of the sacred work that took place in this green sanctuary. Ione came to gather herbs for the evening's incense, selecting each plant with the same care she had used in the morning's preparations. She moved slowly among the aromatic plants, touching their leaves gently and breathing in their fragrances before making her selections. The gathering of herbs was itself a ritual performed according to traditions that had been passed down through generations of temple servants. Each plant was approached with a prayer of gratitude, asking permission before any cutting was done. The harvesting was performed with a small silver knife that had been blessed for this purpose, and each cut was made cleanly and carefully to avoid damaging the plant's ability to continue growing. The herbs that were gathered were not taken randomly, but selected according to their specific properties and the needs of the evening's ceremonies. Some were chosen for their ability to promote calm and contemplation, others for their power to enhance spiritual awareness, still others for their capacity to purify and protect. Each selection was made with knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of experience, understanding that went far beyond simple botanical facts to encompass the subtle energies and influences that each plant carried. Thalia arrived in the garden carrying a scroll and a small writing tablet, seeking the peaceful atmosphere of this green space for her afternoon study. She settled herself beneath one of the olive trees, her back against its ancient trunk, and began to read from texts that contained the accumulated wisdom of generations of priestesses who had served in this temple. The texts she studied were not just religious instructions or ceremonial procedures, but profound meditations on the nature of the divine and the proper relationship between mortals and gods. They contained stories of the goddesses' interactions with humanity, parables that taught important lessons about wisdom and justice, and philosophical reflections on the mysteries that lay at the heart of existence. But Thalia's study was not the passive absorption of information that we might associate with academic learning. Instead, it was an active engagement with the texts, a dialogue between her own understanding and the wisdom of those who had come before her. As she read, she would pause frequently to reflect on what she had learned, to consider how the ancient teachings applied to the challenges and opportunities of her own time. Sometimes she would take up her stylus and make notes on her writing tablet, recording insights that had come to her during her reading or questions that she wanted to explore further. These notes were not just personal reminders, but contributions to the ongoing tradition of temple scholarship, additions to the body of knowledge that would be passed on to future generations of priestesses. The afternoon study session was interrupted periodically by visitors to the temple, pilgrims who had come seeking the goddess's blessing, local residents who needed advice or healing, travelers who wished to make offerings in gratitude for safe journeys. Each visitor was received with the same gracious attention, regardless of their social status or the nature of their request. Melania, who had particular gifts for counseling and guidance, would often meet with these visitors in a small alcove adjacent to the garden, where the peaceful atmosphere and the gentle sounds of growing things created an ideal environment for intimate conversation. Her approach to these meetings was not that of someone dispensing wisdom from a position of authority, but of a fellow seeker who had perhaps traveled a little further along the path of understanding. The conversations that took place in these afternoon sessions were as varied as the people who sought them out. Sometimes they involved practical matters, questions about the proper way to make offerings, requests for prayers for sick family members, concerns about business ventures or family relationships. Other times they delved into deeper spiritual territory, struggles with doubt or despair, questions about the meaning of suffering, searches for purpose and direction in life. But regardless of the specific topic, Melania's approach was always the same. She listened with complete attention, offering the gift of her presence and her genuine care for the person who had come seeking help. She asked thoughtful questions that helped visitors clarify their own thinking and discover their own inner wisdom. And when she offered advice or guidance, it was always given with humility and respect for the visitor's own capacity to find their way. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the garden took on a different quality of light and atmosphere. The harsh brightness of midday gave way to a softer, more golden radiance that seemed to bring out the deeper colors of the flowers and the richer textures of the leaves. The air became cooler and more fragrant, filled with the scents of the herbs and flowers that had been warmed by the sun throughout the day. The priestesses began to gather the fruits of their afternoon labors, the herbs that had been collected, the insights that had been gained from study, the connections that had been made with visitors seeking guidance. But more than these tangible results, they carried with them a sense of deep satisfaction that came from having spent their time in ways that honored both their own spiritual development and their service to others. The afternoon of contemplation was drawing to a close, but its effects would continue to resonate throughout the evening and into the night. The priestesses had used these quiet hours to deepen their understanding, to strengthen their connection to the natural world, and to practice the kind of compassionate service that was at the heart of their calling. They had shown that the sacred could be found not just in dramatic ceremonies and mystical experiences, but in the patient, faithful attention to the small details of daily life that created the foundation for all deeper spiritual work. As the shadows began to lengthen and the first hints of evening appeared in the sky, the priestesses began to prepare for the transition to the next phase of their daily rhythm. The afternoon had been a time of gentle activity and quiet reflection, but the evening would bring its own opportunities for worship and service, its own chances to encounter the divine in new and meaningful ways. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills and the temple filled with the golden light of late afternoon, I sensed a shift in the atmosphere that spoke of approaching mysteries. The evening hours in the temple were different from the bright clarity of morning or the contemplative peace of afternoon. They carried with them a sense of anticipation, of preparation for encounters with the divine that could only take place when the boundary between day and night became thin and permeable. The transformation began subtly, with small changes in the way the priestesses moved and spoke. Their voices became softer, more reverent, as if they were already beginning to enter the sacred space of evening worship. Their movements became more deliberate, more ceremonial, as they began the preparations that would transform the temple from a place of daily service into a sanctuary where the deepest mysteries could unfold. Melania began the evening preparations by dimming some of the oil lamps that had burned brightly throughout the day, creating pools of softer light that seemed to invite contemplation and introspection. The harsh clarity of noon gave way to a more mysterious illumination, one that revealed some things while leaving others in shadow, creating an atmosphere where the imagination could begin to perceive truths that were hidden from ordinary sight. The altar, which had been beautiful in the morning light, now took on an almost magical quality as the changing light played across its marble surfaces and bronze fittings. The statue of Athena seemed to come alive in the flickering lamplight, her carved features appearing to shift and change as the shadows moved across her face. The owl perched on her shoulder seemed to turn its head slightly, as if it were watching the preparations with intelligent interest. But it was not just the lighting that created this sense of approaching mystery. It was the way the priestesses began to prepare themselves for the evening's ceremonies. They moved to a small chamber adjacent to the main sanctuary, where they began the process of ritual purification that would make them worthy to participate in the sacred rites that were to come. The purification began with the washing of hands and feet in water from the sacred spring, but this was not the simple cleansing that had marked the morning preparations. Instead, it was a ritual that engaged the entire being, body and soul, in the process of becoming ready to encounter the divine. Each priestess washed slowly and mindfully, using the time not just to clean her physical form, but to cleanse her thoughts and intentions as well. After the washing came the anointing with sacred oils, each one chosen for its specific properties and its ability to enhance spiritual awareness. The oil of olive, pressed from the fruit of the goddess's own tree, was applied to the forehead as a symbol of wisdom and understanding. The oil of rose, distilled from flowers that had been blessed in the temple's garden, was touched to the heart as a reminder of the love that should motivate all sacred service. The oil of frankincense, precious and rare, was placed on the palms of the hands as a sign of the prayers that would be offered during the evening's ceremonies. But perhaps most significant of all was the changing of garments that marked the transition from the ordinary activities of the day to the sacred work of evening worship. The simple robes that the priestesses had worn during their daily tasks were replaced with ceremonial vestments that had been woven specifically for temple use and blessed according to ancient traditions. These ceremonial robes were works of art in themselves, made from the finest linen and dyed with colors that had symbolic meaning. Melania's robe was deep blue, the color of the night sky and of the wisdom that came with contemplation of the infinite. Thalia wore white, symbolizing purity and the clarity of understanding that came with years of faithful service. Ione was dressed in silver grey, the colour of the olive leaves and of the quiet wisdom that grew slowly over time. And Demetria wore deep purple, the colour of royalty and of the mysteries that could only be approached by those who had proven their dedication. The robes themselves were decorated with symbols that told the story of the goddess and her relationship with humanity. There were owls embroidered in gold thread, their eyes seeming to watch with benevolent intelligence. There were olive branches worked in silver, their leaves catching the lamplight and seeming to shimmer with life. There were geometric patterns that represented the order and harmony that the goddess brought to the world, and flowing designs that spoke of the creative energy that flowed from the divine source into all of creation. As the priestesses completed their preparations and began to gather in the main sanctuary, the temple took on an atmosphere that was both solemn and joyful, filled with anticipation for the sacred drama that was about to unfold. The evening ceremony was different from the rituals of morning and midday. It was more intimate, more mystical, designed to create conditions where the deepest truths could be revealed and the most profound connections could be made. The ceremony began with the lighting of special lamps that were used only for evening worship. These lamps were made of silver and bronze, their surfaces decorated with images of stars and moons and other symbols of the night. The oil that fed their flames had been blessed with prayers and mixed with aromatic substances that would fill the temple with fragrances that were believed to be pleasing to the goddess and conducive to spiritual awareness. As the lamps were lit, the priestesses began to chant in voices that seemed to blend with the flickering of the flames and the rising of the aromatic smoke. But this chanting was different from the morning hymns or the midday prayers. It was more complex, more layered, with harmonies that seemed to create spaces where the divine voice could be heard speaking to those who had ears to hear. The words they sang told the story of the goddess's birth from the head of Zeus, her emergence as the embodiment of wisdom and strategic thinking. They spoke of her gifts to humanity, the olive tree that provided food and oil and wood, the arts of weaving and pottery that allowed civilization to flourish, the skills of warfare that protected the innocent and preserved justice. But more than just recounting these familiar stories, the chanting seemed to make them present and immediate, as if the events they described were happening again in the sacred space of the temple. As the chanting continued, Thalia stepped forward and began to read from one of the most sacred texts in the temple's collection, a scroll that contained prophecies and visions that had been received by priestesses in ages past. Her voice took on a different quality as she read, becoming deeper and more resonant, as if she was speaking not just her own words, but channeling the voice of the goddess herself. The prophecies she read spoke of the eternal struggle between wisdom and ignorance, between justice and chaos, between the forces that built up and those that tore down. They told of the goddess's promise to guide and protect those who sought truth and justice, and of the rewards that awaited those who dedicated their lives to sacred service. But they also warned of the challenges that would face the faithful, the tests that would prove their dedication, and the sacrifices that would be required of those who chose to walk the path of wisdom. As Thalia read, the other priestesses continued their chanting, their voices creating a background of sound that seemed to support and amplify the words of the prophecy. The combination of voice and music created an atmosphere that was both hypnotic and inspiring, drawing the listeners deeper into the sacred reality that was being revealed. The climax of the evening ceremony came when Melania approached the altar carrying a special offering, a golden bowl filled with wine that had been blessed and consecrated for this purpose. The wine was not ordinary vintage, but liquid that had been prepared according to ancient recipes and infused with herbs that were believed to enhance spiritual awareness and create connections between the mortal and divine realms. As she poured the wine onto the altar, allowing it to flow over the marble surface and pool at the base of the goddess's statue, Melania spoke words of dedication and commitment that had been passed down through generations of priestesses. She offered not just the wine, but the lives and service of all who served in the temple, asking the goddess to accept their devotion and to continue to guide them in their sacred work. The wine seemed to glow as it flowed, catching the light of the lamps and creating patterns that seemed almost like writing, as if the goddess were inscribing her acceptance of the offering in liquid gold. The fragrance that rose from the altar was intoxicating, not in the sense of causing drunkenness, but in the way it seemed to lift the spirit and open the mind to perceptions that were normally hidden from ordinary consciousness. As the ceremony reached its conclusion, the priestesses stood in silence around the altar, their faces illuminated by the flickering lamplight, their expressions reflecting the deep peace and joy that came from having participated in something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of human experience. They had offered their worship and their service, and they had received in return a renewed sense of connection to the divine source that gave meaning and purpose to their lives. The evening mysteries were complete, but their effects would continue to resonate throughout the night and into the days that followed. The priestesses had been renewed in their dedication, strengthened in their faith, and prepared for whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. They had shown that the divine was not distant and unreachable, but present and accessible to those who approached with sincere hearts and dedicated lives. As the last echoes of the evening ceremony faded into the marble columns and the temple settled into the profound quiet of night, I discovered that the sacred work did not end with the setting of the sun. Instead, it transformed into something even more intimate and mysterious, the night watch, when a single priestess would remain awake through the dark hours, tending the sacred flame and maintaining the connection between the mortal world and the realm of the gods. Tonight, it was Ione's turn to keep the vigil, and I watched as she prepared herself for the long hours ahead, with the same careful attention she brought to all her temple duties. The other priestesses had retired to their sleeping chambers, But Ione would remain in the sanctuary until dawn, guardian of the sacred fire and witness to the mysteries that could only be revealed in the deep silence of night. The temple at night was a different place entirely from the busy sanctuary of the day. The sounds of daily activity had faded away, leaving only the gentle whisper of the eternal flame and the soft sighs of the night wind moving through the columns. The lamplight that had seemed warm and welcoming during the day now created pools of golden radiance surrounded by deep shadows, transforming familiar spaces into realms of mystery and contemplation. Ione moved through this transformed landscape with the quiet confidence of someone who had kept many such vigils, her bare feet making no sound on the marble floors that had been worn smooth by generations of worshippers. She carried with her a small oil lamp, its flame dancing gently as she walked, casting moving shadows that seemed to bring the carved decorations on the walls to life. Her first task was to check the sacred flame that burned continuously at the heart of the temple. This flame had been burning for more than a century, tended day and night by priestesses who understood that to let it die would be to break the connection between the goddess and her people. The flame was more than just fire. It was a living symbol of the divine presence, a beacon that called to the goddess and assured her that she was still remembered and honored in this place. The tending of the flame required both practical skill and spiritual sensitivity. Ione examined the oil reservoir that fed the flame, ensuring that there was sufficient fuel to last through the night. She trimmed the wick with a small silver tool, removing the charred portions that could cause the flame to smoke or flicker. And she adjusted the airflow around the flame, opening or closing small vents that controlled how brightly it burned. But more than these mechanical tasks, Ione's care of the flame was an act of devotion, a conversation with the divine presence that was believed to dwell within the fire. As she worked, she whispered prayers and words of gratitude, acknowledging the goddess's continued presence and asking for guidance and protection through the night ahead. The flame responded to her attention, burning more steadily and brightly, its light seeming to pulse with a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. In the deep quiet of the night, it was easy to believe that the fire was indeed alive, that it possessed some form of consciousness that could respond to the love and care it received from those who tended it. With the sacred flame properly tended, Ione began her circuit of the temple, checking each of the smaller lamps and oil burners that provided illumination throughout the sanctuary. Some of these lamps were allowed to burn out during the night, their oil consumed and their wicks exhausted, but others were maintained at a low level of illumination to provide light for anyone who might need to move through the temple during the dark hours. The process of tending these lamps was meditative, almost hypnotic in its repetition. Each lamp required individual attention. Some needed more oil, others required wick trimming, still others needed to be repositioned to provide better illumination. But the work was not tedious or burdensome. Instead, it was a form of moving meditation, a way of staying present and alert while allowing the mind to settle into the deep peace that came with solitary communion with the divine. As she moved through the temple, Ione was accompanied by the gentle sounds of the night, the soft hooting of owls in the olive grove outside, the distant murmur of the sacred spring, the almost inaudible whisper of the wind moving through the columns. These sounds were not distractions from her spiritual practice, but part of it, reminders of the natural world that surrounded the temple and of the goddess's presence in all of creation. The night watch was not just about maintaining the physical aspects of the temple, but about creating and maintaining a spiritual atmosphere that would be conducive to divine visitation. The ancient Greeks believed that the gods were more likely to appear to mortals during the quiet hours of night, when the busy activities of the day had ceased and the mind was free to perceive subtler realities. Ione understood this, and she moved through her duties with an awareness that she might at any moment encounter something beyond the ordinary. She listened not just to the sounds of the night, but to the silences between them. She watched not just the flames of the lamps, but the shadows they cast. She remained alert to any sign that the goddess might be drawing near, ready to receive whatever message or vision might be granted to her. The hours of the night watch passed slowly, marked not by the striking of clocks, but by the gradual movement of the stars across the sky and the subtle changes in the quality of the darkness. Ione had learned to read these natural timepieces, to know by the position of certain constellations how much of the night had passed and how much remained until dawn. During the deepest part of the night, when the darkness was most complete and the silence most profound, Ione would often experience moments of extraordinary clarity and peace. These were times when the boundary between her individual consciousness and the larger consciousness of the divine seemed to dissolve, when she felt herself to be not just a servant of the goddess, but a part of the goddess herself. In these moments, she would sometimes receive insights or visions that would guide her in her service or provide answers to questions that had been troubling her. These experiences were not dramatic or overwhelming, but gentle and natural, like the gradual dawning of understanding or the quiet recognition of truth that had always been present but previously unnoticed. Sometimes the visions took the form of memories that seemed to come from beyond her own experience. Glimpses of the temple in earlier times, when different priestesses had kept the same vigil she was keeping now. She would see women in ancient robes moving through the same spaces, tending the same flame, performing the same rituals with the same devotion and care. These visions created a sense of connection across time, a feeling of being part of an unbroken chain of service that stretched back to the very founding of the temple. Other times, the insights came as a deeper understanding of the goddess herself, not as a distant deity to be worshipped from afar, but as a living presence that permeated all of existence. In these moments, Ione would feel Athena's wisdom flowing through her own thoughts, the goddess's compassion filling her own heart, the divine love expressing itself through her own capacity for care and service. As the night progressed and the first hints of dawn began to appear in the eastern sky, Ione would begin the process of preparing the temple for the return of the other priestesses and the resumption of the day's activities. This involved not just the practical tasks of refilling oil lamps and arranging the altar, but the spiritual work of carrying forward the insights and blessings she had received during her solitary vigil. The transition from night to day was gradual and gentle, marked by the slow brightening of the sky and the gradual awakening of the birds in the olive grove. Ione would watch this transformation with the same attention she had given to the flames and shadows of the night, seeing in the return of light a daily miracle that never lost its power to inspire wonder and gratitude. By the time the other priestesses began to stir and the temple started to fill with the sounds of morning preparation, Ione had completed her watch and was ready to pass the responsibility for the temple's care to others. But she carried with her the peace and wisdom she had gained during the night hours, gifts that would inform her service throughout the day ahead. The night watch was more than just a practical necessity. It was a spiritual discipline that created opportunities for the deepest forms of communion with the divine. It required dedication, patience, and the willingness to remain alert and present during the hours when most people were asleep. But for those who undertook it with sincere hearts, it offered rewards that could not be found in any other form of spiritual practice. As I watched Ione complete her vigil and prepare to rest after her long night of service, I understood that what I had witnessed was not just the tending of lamps and flames, but the maintenance of something far more precious, the connection between heaven and earth, the bridge between the mortal and divine realms that made it possible for the goddess to remain present and active in the world. The night watch was ending, but its effects would continue throughout the day and into the nights that followed. The flame that Ione had tended would continue to burn, the insights she had received would continue to guide her service, and the connection she had maintained between the temple and the divine realm would continue to bless all who entered this sacred space seeking wisdom, healing, and the touch of the eternal. The scroll is closed now. The room is quiet. The candles are low. We have walked beside those who understood that the sacred was not separate from the ordinary, but woven through every moment of daily life. Who knew that the divine could be found as surely in the grinding of incense as in the grandest ceremony, as clearly in the tending of a garden as in the most mystical vision? Their temples have crumbled to marble fragments. Their names have been forgotten by history. But the wisdom they carried, the understanding that every act performed with reverence becomes a prayer, that every moment lived with awareness becomes sacred, that the gods dwell not in distant realms, but in the patient attention we bring to the simplest tasks. This wisdom echoes still in the quiet spaces where seekers gather to tend their own inner flames. Rest if you wish, and know that somewhere in the gentle hours between sleeping and waking, the ancient rituals continue, performed by those who understood that the greatest mysteries are often the quietest ones, revealed not through dramatic revelation, but through the faithful, loving attention to the sacred work that each day brings. Until next time, this has been Yawn Through Time.